Welcome back, students, the last of our 4 videos on disability. In this last video, I want to talk about this fascinating new discipline, disability studies. This discipline arose out of the social model of disability that I introduced in my last presentation. I'll also be talking about inclusion. So a new discipline is born. Disabled researchers in the English-speaking countries have found themselves working in a new field, a new discipline, and we call this discipline disability studies. For orientation, it's worth noting there's definitely parallels here with the development of, say, gender studies or critical race studies, critical race theory. So this is not alone, this new discipline. It's part maybe of a range of disciplines inspired by social movements going back to the 1960s. To orientate yourself, what is this discipline like? It definitely has links to cultural studies, and it definitely has links to sociology. To the extent that a cultural studies or sociology textbook, an introductory text, might have a chapter on, say, the body, health and disability in each one of those 2 cases. So it's overlapping with other disciplines. The way in which societies disable is a key area of studies. So the idea of me being a person with an impairment and this society disabling me in a particular way. Examining that as a process, we talked about barriers in our last video, didn't we? Examining this process of disabling often involves this new term, disablement. So a disability studies researcher might say, I study processes of disablement. Often in disability studies, the researcher is disabled, not always, of course, often, but not always. So lots of the experts themselves have experienced life as a disabled person. Disability studies is closely linked to the disabled people's movement, which is, of course, a political activism movement. You can also talk about the disability rights movement. So this is kind of interesting. This is a very politicized discipline, if you like. Again, another parallel to gender or critical race studies. Yeah, I want to pause here and natter with your partner. What do you think of this discipline? I'm maybe telling you about it for the first time. Is this a good concept to have a discipline like this or not? What do you think? Have a natter. Yeah, I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to that question. I certainly find it stimulating. I stumbled across literature in the area of disability studies whilst I was a social work student. And surfing the internet, I found bachelor's degrees. You can study this as a bachelor student. Typically, I think I was coming across courses where you'd have disability studies coupled with something like community development. So it's a discipline leading, of course, to future employment possibilities. And I found it very refreshing. As a social work student, I was reading literature written by disabled people, literature which really was insightful and an absolutely great learning possibility for a non-disabled person. It's interesting thinking about this new discipline of disability studies from the Germany perspective. Another question for you to discuss with your partner. Is there a strong tradition of disability studies in German universities? Had you heard about it before I started telling you about it? And if I'm interested in disability, what might I study in Germany? I've just mentioned you could do this as a bachelor's degree in the UK or America. What about in Germany? If my interest is disability, what might the name in German be of my bachelor's course? Again, discuss that with your neighbour. Well, to give you answers from my perspective, as far as I know, it's still a very young discipline in Germany. It's not well established in Germany as it is in the English-speaking countries. My impression is that it found a kind of internationalization more in areas like Scandinavia than in countries like Germany. There's various reasons for that. Of course, one reason is our German idea of the status hierarchies of experts. The idea of the university professor, that person is the expert in their area. Their expertise comes not necessarily from experience, but rather from an impressive selection of research, of publications, and so on. So it doesn't quite fit into the high status German university system, acknowledging the expert as being an expert by experience. Maybe that's something that we Germans are slightly less willing to do. Good. And what I just said about the university approach to being an expert in an area, disability programs, well, we can list them, can't we? You've got special education, you've got rehabilitation science, rehabilitation education, I think exists. You've got, I think, Behindertenpädagogik, yeah, hard to translate that, Heilpädagogik, and outside of the university system, something like Heilerziehungspflege. So we definitely have a whole bunch of programs. Today you might even add inclusive education to that. You know, we have our traditions in Germany and they are rich, but they're quite different from this disability studies approach. Hey, I need to end this talk by talking about the word that's been in our minds probably for the last 3.5 videos, this idea of inclusion. I've got to say a few words about inclusion and inclusion in Germany. The word and the concept is an old one in the English-speaking countries. Something like 13, 14 years ago, it must have been 2007, a German colleague wrote me an email saying to me, you must be talking a lot about inclusion right now in English-speaking discourses. In a strange sense, I wasn't especially sensitive to it. There was a reason why she was noting that in 2007, but for me it was very much an established discourse rather than an older one. And that really is the case if you look at the legislation. Here in the US, we had a 1975, look at this, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So this was a law passed through Parliament, 1975, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. That said that there was a duty, an obligation for the local authority to place the disabled child in the least restrictive environment. So when choosing a school for a disabled child, that school had to be the least restrictive environment. And this is to be understood as not in a special school if possible. In other words, an obligation for the authorities to check this child that we wish to place in a special school, could we place that child in a mainstream school instead? Obviously with a special support package to go with it. So an example of progressive thinking in this area, and laws like this reflected activism campaigning by disability rights campaigners over the 10 years that preceded it. And again, if you look at this law with German eyes and you think, wow, 1975, and we started thinking about it in Germany in what, 2006, 2007, I have feelings of shame reflecting on that difference. So there's definitely differences in how different countries approach inclusion. For many people, for the Americans, for example, it might be seen as being a kind of natural model for education. Why do you think inclusive models of education have been so popular in some countries? In the English-speaking countries, for example, Spain, Italy, Scandinavia. Why? You know, do you have any ad hoc explanations here? There definitely are trends. Natter with your neighbour. Try to come up with as many reasons as you can. Pause here. I mean, I'd be interested to actually hear your answers. Maybe we can share them because it is quite fascinating. I don't have any good answer here, one answer that covers all of these countries. I think for various cultural reasons, you get high levels of inclusion in certain societies. In the Nordic context, I'm thinking of Nordic social policy, Nordic society. Nordic people are by nature very inclusive. I think Nordic people have inclusive instincts. They're not interested in, say, different categorizations of people. There is definitely a feeling in the Nordic countries that we are all much the same, so it would be wrong to maybe separate. So that's maybe one ad hoc explanation covering the Nordic countries. In Spain and Italy, maybe there's Catholic values that somehow explain the inclusive tendencies there. Again, in Spain and Italy, very few kids would be visiting a special school. Again, I'm not quite sure what the explanation would be in England or America, maybe based on practical argumentation. It's a difficult question to answer. Sorry, I've asked you a question which I don't have the answer to myself, but it's still a fascinating question. I've already mentioned the interest in Germany something like 10, 12 years ago. The importance of inclusion was underlined by the United Nations. We finally had the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities signed in 2006. For the European Union, the convention acquired force of law in 2011. Then things for us started to get serious. The convention obliged states to quickly address their disability rights records. Suddenly, we were looking at this. That's the wonderful thing about these United Nations conventions. They force the public view onto a particular group of people and their own vulnerability. So we were kind of in the public eye suddenly. Everybody was thinking about disability rights. Everybody was thinking about inclusion. We had a European disability strategy over that 10-year period. And for some states, this meant very, very hurried education reforms. As I said, not all states. Some had been already being inclusive for decades anyway. I think in Italy, for example, it goes back to the 1960s. So for some states, they had to change very quickly. For others, there wasn't that urgency. They had already introduced inclusive systems. Yeah, my next question for you, and I'm guessing this is an almost rhetorical question on my part. How was it in Germany? How do you think Germany was doing providing inclusive school education at this time? Pause here. Well, the answer is really quite gloomy. How were we doing at this time? We were doing badly. Here's a quote, this is sobering stuff. In contrast to a great number of its European neighbours, Germany has a considerable need to catch up on the development towards an inclusive education system. Isn't that painful to read? So pained self-reflection here, only 9 years ago. And it's worth stressing the word Inklusion, it didn't really exist in German until the mid-2000s. We had our own favourite German concepts. We had our Eingliederung, our Integration. You know, we were quite good at picking a few disabled people out, maybe less disabled people, and then inserting them into our mainstream education. But the idea of somehow beginning a process by which everybody had equal opportunities to mainstream education, you know, that was an idea that we found very, very exotic. And the word Inklusion was a strange word on German tongues in those early years of the movement. In Germany, it really must be stressed here, traditionally most disabled children have visited special schools. When I came to Germany 20 years ago, I think something like 5%, almost 5% of children actually went to a special school. And of course, I was gobsmacked hearing this as a Brit. Actually, the numbers in Britain weren't so great either. The British reform was also slow. It was glacial at best. But the German situation really was quite different. Germany was not alone. Countries like Belgium also had very high levels. And again, to put that 5% figure or 4.5% figure into context, this would have been something like 85% of children diagnosed as having a disability. So if you had a disability in Germany when I came 20 years ago, the chances were something like 85% likelihood that you would end up in segregated education. Goes without saying, for other countries, it's a fraction of that. Germany has a very well built up system of segregated special schools. Cities, big cities, may have 10 different types of special school. I was an English teacher back in 2002, 2003, and I was teaching German primary school teachers. They had to get a special English certificate. And I had one class that was made up entirely of special school teachers. I didn't know anything about it back then, and I asked them, what kind of schools do you work in? And each one of my 10 students listed a separate type of special school. So the first would say, I work in a special school for physically disabled children. The second would say, I work in a special school for children with minor learning difficulties. The next one would say, a special school for children with more serious learning difficulties. The next one would say, a special school for children of autism, a special school for children with hearing difficulties, and so on. You know, really 10 different types. Again, the contrast, other European countries, again, Spain, Italy, the Nordic countries, something like 5% of children in special education. Interesting questions. Why is Germany so different here? You know, why are we so distinct? Why have we had this segregation history? And again, looking into the future, how is this going to change? People have been talking about the change, the shift to inclusive education for the last 10 or 12 years. You know, where is this going? Does it have enough momentum? If you have friends who are school teachers, this is a fascinating topic to think about. So here you are, this particular topic brings us to a close. As always, there's a whole bunch of fascinating further reading if you're interested. If you have a chance and if you're passionate about inclusive education, although Germany has a reputation for being bad at this, there are wonderful examples of good practice in Germany. And I've sometimes shown my students the film Berg Fidel. It's beautiful. It's just so lovely to see the sensitivity with which the teachers work and the real philosophy of inclusion in that school. So yeah, we have something to be proud of in terms of our individual examples of really good practice. I hope you've enjoyed these disability themed videos. Thanks for watching.